Hi, I'm Bob Whitty with KPND in Sandpoint, Idaho. If I can be a fan of Skylight Books, LA's world-famous independent bookstore, from way up here in the Idaho Panhandle, then you can too from wherever you are. Visit the website, buy some books. You can even join their membership club and reap the benefits of supporting independent booksellers. Thanks.
Meet me on the softer side. Meet me on the softer side. Softer side of your heart.
Hi there, and welcome to the Skylight Books Author Reading Series. You can find out about this and all of our other author events at www.skylightbooks.com, where you can also browse our inventory as well as order books online. You can also follow us on Twitter or even be our friend at facebook.com. If you'd like to talk to a real person, we can be reached at 323-660-1175. And don't forget, Skylight Books depends on listeners like you to help support us. So whether you're in our neighborhood or browsing online, buy a book or two to help ensure that we'll be around for a long, long time. Thanks and enjoy.
What I heard was a sound of hissing, and at first I thought there's a gas leak. Let me go and check. But I thought, oh no, there's no gas here. It's just all electric. And then I thought, is it a snake? I looked around. No, snakes hibernate in the winter. What could it possibly be? A leak of water? No, I inspected the house. There was nothing at all. It took me a long while to figure out that what I was really listening to was the sound of my own body. I had never been in a place of such perfect silence before. And I think it was at that moment that this particular journey, the journey of this book, began. And I knew that I was going to write something from that moment on. And it's a book of living and moving through the Southwest desert borderlands. And it's a book of memoir, but it tells the stories of many other people who had made the desert their home long before I had, and in some cases millennia, and also a book about just how the desert West has been transformed in the last generation in many respects, demographically, politically, shifting from red to blue in several key states: Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada. Without those three states, Barack Obama would not be in the White House today. And without those three states, he cannot remain in the White House this time around. And also, I would say that in the last 10, 15 years, with the boom and the bust cycle, it was seen nowhere more dramatically than on this particular landscape. The Western version of the 1 and the 99 is written big as the West itself. The extremes of wealth and poverty that we see in the West today are the most extreme in the country. It's the highest rates of foreclosure, the highest rates of unemployment, and at the same time, the greatest pockets of wealth in the country. And I was living right in between those spaces. So I'll read a short section from the book, and we'd love to hear comments, questions, desert stories from you all. Thank you again for being here. This is a section when I arrive in northern New Mexico, which is where my wife Angela ended up not dragging me, because I went totally willingly. After I got my life back together in Joshua Tree, I met Angela. And she's an anthropologist, and she was doing her dissertation research in northern New Mexico. And she said, do you want to come with me? And I said, yeah, absolutely. Northern New Mexico. Immediately in my head, what I'm seeing are the landscapes. You know, I'm imagining Monument Valley. I'm imagining John Ford vistas. I'm imagining George O'Keeffe and R.C. Gorman and, I'm not thinking of people on the land at that point. I'm thinking about the land, the landscape. And somehow, the fact that Angela is a medical anthropologist and was going to study heroin addiction in the Espanola Valley of northern New Mexico, that fact, that dark fact, had receded to the back of my mind. So, here we are in the village of Velarde, population 800 in northern New Mexico, where Angela and I have just moved, and this is the first thing we hear from our neighbors. Get the fuck out of here! Sunday afternoon. For the past hour, screaming and crying, fists pounding on a car hood, screen doors slamming, and in the midst of the battle, the voice of a small boy talking to himself in a make-believe game. I said, I want you out of here. These are my neighbors. Rose Garcia and Jose Martinez. Garcia Martinez, I happen to be Martinez. Angela happens to be Garcia. Rose Garcia and Jose Martinez, a couple, both 23 years old. Their boy is perhaps 5. She's light-skinned with long, thick black hair that she teases up in front, old-school Chicana style. She is somewhat pear-shaped, and what's striking about her body is the constant tension of it, every pose tense and blunt as a hammer. She almost always wears T-shirts and pants and flip-flops. Jose Martinez is short and wiry. He wears his baseball caps backwards, XXX size white T-shirts, and during the summer, shorts and tennis shoes. I have never seen him without his head covered. What little hair peeks out from beneath the cap is cut very close, a crew cut. I rarely hear his voice, even though the courtyard in front of the house somehow acts as a megaphone so that the southern end of the village can listen in on everything. It's almost always Rose's screams we hear. The fights occur a couple of times a week. I'm in the attic. We live in a 100-year-old adobe. Think just New Mexico pastoral, tin roof, peaked adobe walls, right? 100 years old, American pastoral. And that's what all the houses look like up there, okay? I'm in the attic. I've made my writing space next to the window that looks out toward Joe Rendon's trailer. We would ultimately refer to Joe Rendon and his family. Angela and I would talk about him as being the good neighbor. Toward Joe Rendon's trailer, the Juniper Hills beyond the highway, I've taken one of the old heavy doors stored in the garage and propped it up on sawhorses. The door probably hung in one of the original bedrooms downstairs. It's now my writing desk. You took my mota! She's accusing him of stealing her marijuana. I didn't take your mota, bitch! When I hear the screams, I edge up to the window at the other end of the attic where Angela writes and where I have a direct view of Rose and Jose's. I'm careful to remain in shadow, although I doubt my neighbors can see me, given the angle and the distance. In any case, they're too deep in their own moment to look across the courtyard and up to the tiny window of their neighbor's attic. Sometimes Angela joins me. I kneel by the window and she stands. Or I sit in the rocking chair and she sits on the floor and rests her chin on an arm she supports on the windowsill. We stay for as long as the fight lasts, until he jumps into his car and drives off in a cloud of dust. Only rarely does she drive off. Upon his return, it'll start up again, muffled shouting from inside the house, a word, then a phrase, louder, closer to the front door. The door opens, now coming at us full volume. Get the fuck out of my life. This is her most oft-repeated line. She struts back inside again. The door slams. Now it's quiet in the courtyard and in the rest of the village. There was a late season frost last night, but the sun has warmed the Espanola Valley. The local weather forecaster wrote that it was going to be a Chamber of Commerce day. Flies buzz lazily in the yellow and green and blue of spring. I can hear the rhythmic whir of a few cicadas, the first of the year, coming up from the riverside. The river is the Rio Grande. We're about 300 yards from it. The whoosh of cars and trucks up and down the highway, the distant thudding of locals taking target practice on the BLM land across the road. We are surrounded by millions of acres of public land that once belonged to the ancestors of my neighbors. And suddenly, go to that little puta of yours. Her voice builds and crests in a shriek, which usually happens on the final word of a phrase like life. taking the vowel and bending it in several different directions before her breath runs out. She coughs a lot. I hear it early in the morning, late at night. I hear it very clearly when she's sitting on the patio smoking a joint. It's quick and sharp, the throat clenching and tissue grating deep inside her chest. Every once in a great while, he responds, but he never shouts as loudly as she does. Look at you, you're psycho, eh? They are dealing. We have noticed the traffic. Perhaps a dozen cars a day drive through. The customers are men, all Hispanos, as many Mexican Americans refer to themselves in northern New Mexico. Young and old, mostly in work trucks. Some come early in the morning, apparently on their way to a trade job, plumbing, electrical. Others in the early evening, clearly after finishing work. Some in the middle of the day, some in the wee hours. It's Rose's house. The Garcias are as prominent in the area as the Rendones. One member of the clan owns the nightclub in the village, another the fruit stand that's never open at the intersection of the highway with the Leiden Road. The Garcias, I am told, are an old, connected family, so well connected that our landlady passed on to us the advice she was given by the cops when she suspected that Jose had stolen her lawnmower. We can't do anything to them, the cops said. But if you want to take action on your own, shoot him, drag him into your house, and make it look like self-defense against breaking and entering. Get the fuck out of here, you fuck. You and your pills. You think I'm fucked up? Look in the mirror. So Angela and I watch and listen through the screens on the attic windows. The journalist in me thinks, talk to them. Get close. This is what I tell my writing students all the time. Get close, get close. You know, documentary intimacy. But we already are close. These are my neighbors. Rose is aware of our presence. During the first fright we witnessed, which occurred just a couple of weeks after our arrival, and which included Rose and another woman coming to blows on the patio, she screamed, "I don't need this shit. I've got new neighbors." Outsiders. I could imagine her calculating, perhaps even thinking of us as gringos. Angela drives a Subaru, and Ruben never leaves the house before 10 in the morning. Because class can trump race, and in New Mexico, race does not necessarily mean color. Plenty of Hispanos who claim Spanish lineage back it up with light skin and eyes. So over a period of months of adjusting to our arrival in Velarde, we come to an agreement, all of us. They won't get in our shit, and we won't get in theirs. Which means we must not feel compassion, or loathing, or fear. We must not feel anything for each other. But still, I go to the window in the attic. When Joe Rendon and I talk across the fence, the good neighbor, sometimes we'll discuss the latest eruption next door. He shakes his head. Joe's young, but he talks like he's old, a man of tradition. He's always reminding me that the Rendones own the land all the way from the highway to the river. There were orchards and pasture, Joe says, cows and sheep. And there was good snow every winter and good rain every summer. Oh yeah, there were fights, of course, and lots of drinking, but not cocaine and not heroin. That's for sure. Now look at us. The sun dips below the black mesa, bringing Velarde's early twilight. No matter what time of year it is, the sun goes down an hour earlier here than it does anywhere else. Rose explodes one last time. I can't take it anymore. Now she shoots off in her red Chevy SUV. He stays behind with their son, putters around the yard. She returns in a few minutes, charging down the road in a dust cloud. She screams some more, goes back inside the house. At true dusk, when the last of the sunlight bleeds away from the eastern hills beyond the reach of the mesa's shadow and leaves them in a blue-gray pallor, I hear her screams again. I'm making dinner, sautéing Italian sausage and boiling water for pasta. I walk upstairs to the window where I've spent the better part of the afternoon. I can see the dome light inside Jose's small black sedan with the tinted windows. He's sitting inside, listening to music I can't hear. The little boy is gone. I eat dinner alone. Angela's on the graveyard shift at the detox clinic. On Turner Classic Movies, I watch A Night to Remember. Gentlemen, we're in a precarious situation. I go to the attic to write. I look out the back window one last time. The dome light in the sedan is off now. A thin line of light seeps through the crack at the bottom of the front door. So that was my introduction to northern New Mexico. And thank you. That was my introduction to northern New Mexico, and occurs pretty early on in the book, and is kind of the beginning of a meditation on the idea of neighbors, and just what you're supposed to do in a situation when you're neighbors with a family that's in a situation like this. Complicating it, of course, is the fact that I'm a recovering addict, and Angela's studying addiction, and her family has a whole history of addiction. And we're on this landscape that, to use, there's some academics in the audience tonight, a Freudian term, an overdetermined landscape, right? All the ways that it's been imagined for us, the Western, capital W. And these lives, these complicated, painful, jagged lives, they're completely invisible on this landscape. The tourist imaginaries are like a wallpaper over it, and make these narratives largely invisible. You drive past Velarde. How many people have been in northern New Mexico? If you've ever driven between Santa Fe and Taos, you've gone right through Velarde, but you have not seen it. The road is just slightly above. What you can see, you'll see a couple apple orchards, and you might see the tin roof, the peaked tin roof of one of the old adobes. But the landscape largely hides the human geography. And the tourist imaginaries and the serious money in northern New Mexico, Los Alamos, Taos, and Santa Fe, are three of the richest zip codes, have three of the richest, some of the richest zip codes in the entire country. And they're right next door to some of the poorest places, rural or urban, in the country. And the Espanola Valley is where there's a triangle where all these radically different communities intersect. And I'll leave you with just one last image, and then see if you have any questions. I just went to New Mexico and presented the book there, and a wonderful academic kind of think tank place called the School of, oh my God, I'm blanking on the name, American Research? Yes. SAR had Angela and I present our books there. And this is in Santa Fe, right? And we were feted at a wonderful house up on the hills overlooking the Espanola Valley, where we could kind of like say, hey, that's where Rose and Jose's house is. That's where we used to live. And the owner of the house that we were staying in had been called by the Santa Fe Reporter. The Santa Fe Reporter, local alternative newspaper, did an issue on kind of like the new money that had poured into Santa Fe over the last generation, and it called the owner of this particular house, described him as being richer than God. So we were in that house, and they put us up in a villa at this really amazingly exclusive resort. And when we arrived at the villa where we were staying, there were all these black SUVs and guys like in the bushes, like Secret Service agents, and we're going, is the governor hanging out tonight? And we asked, one of the security people, who's there? He said, Johnny Depp is your neighbor. He was filming The Lone Ranger. I'm not sure, I'm not sure what Johnny Depp is going to do with the Lone Ranger myth. It'll be interesting, to compare what my father heard in the 1940s to the whatever new Western wrinkle Johnny Depp will give. So we go from being Johnny Depp's neighbor to coming back down into the valley, and ultimately to my mother-in-law's house in the South Valley of Albuquerque. And my mother-in-law lives in a very let's just say modest situation. She lives in a trailer on that same landscape, on that same iconic landscape, and is surrounded by hard-scrabble immigrant families, and is surrounded by many of the narratives that some of us have become familiar in recent pop Hollywood history through productions like Breaking Bad. The southwestern deserts are a place of iconic, mythic beauty, and I love the desert, don't get me wrong. I love this place. I'm obsessed with it. I still hike in it every chance I get, and I go for those vistas that I saw as a kid. But it's also a place where there is blood seeping into that sand. The sand is suffused with blood because of the drug war, because of the immigration wars, because of the cleavage between the 1 and the 99, that distance that has been writ so large in the American West. And I argue in this book that really is, that the Desert West is showing the United States itself in a mirror, a very faithful mirror. And so for each of these problems that I raised in the book, I'm searching for some way to be a neighbor to the people that I'm living next door to. So, thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Do you have any questions?
Comments, questions, desert tales? Yes?
So, you're the perfect person to ask, and you're a teacher. What is the shape of the new American dream? What does the new American dream look like?
What does the new American dream look like? Well, in desert America, I'm arguing that...
Which is a good metaphor for...
Yes, indeed. I mean, what we have here, I mean, it's apocalypse, right? Right now, for a tiny few, there is living, like Johnny Depp on top of the hill, with the millionaires. But for the vast majority, I would say, extraordinarily difficult economic circumstances. That said, the West of the last generation has also shown us great progressive politics, wonderful revisions of old Western representations, everything from the novels of John Nichols to westerns, great recent westerns like Paul Thomas Anderson's "There Will Be Blood," which I think tells the story of, even though it's set in the early part of the 20th century, based on Upton Sinclair's novel, tells the story of what we're experiencing right now. I think incredibly accurately. So I think the new Western is helping us deconstruct the old, and also pointing the way towards rescuing the optimism that we've lost in the Great Recession. I mean, Los Angeles, also, we're not in the desert, although it feels like the desert today. Famously, Theodore Roosevelt referred to Los Angeles as being west of the West, right? We're on the coast. But we are ultimately, we're the last stop of Manifest Destiny. And there has been an unbroken lineage of dreamers, idealists, visionaries who have looked at Manifest Destiny history, the bloodiness of it, the injustice of it, and have tried to revise it and turn it on its head and put in place solidarity and hospitality in the place of the ruthlessness of Western capitalism. I mean, because I think what you can argue is that America becomes most itself in the process of Manifest Destiny. It becomes its bloodiest, most violent, and then there's the reaction to that. There's the horrified gaze at what we've become and trying to turn that back. And just look at Los Angeles political history. The moment we're living right now, I'm not predicting that Los Angeles will remain a progressive city forever. It's not going to be the end of history. But I do believe that we've become a progressive city today because of about 100 years of organizing. You know, this didn't happen. Villaraigosa's election and the Cicados mural coming back and Flores Magón being at the Ford Theater, all these things that are going on right now didn't occur in a vacuum. There's been diligent, steady organizing occurring over many, many generations. And in spite of the Red Scare and people going underground and, you know, progressive Los Angeles has survived all that. And today, progressive LA, I mean, we can have arguments about this. Are we a liberal or progressive city? You know, we're probably, you know, somewhere in between, but we're definitely left. I don't think anybody can seriously argue anymore that San Francisco is more left than LA. I mean, that was the old 20th century thing, right? All the lefties were up there, and we were run by Sam Yorty and the WASPs down here. So, I think there's a lot of cause for optimism in terms of there's Jan Brewer on the one hand. That's the Old West, the governor of Arizona, SB 1070. And then there's this West. And there's the West of, you know, Nevada and Colorado and New Mexico, which, you know, I mean, have different shades of ideological moorings. But ultimately, I think, have turned against that Old West and opened up a new space for another way to be a more sustainable mode of living.
I just have one more question. Do we underestimate the neighborhoodness of Johnny Depp?
Do you underestimate?
The neighborhoodness of Johnny Depp?
I never saw him. Never got to party with him. You know, Johnny Depp is, you know, I only mention that because it was just surreal. Just the juxtaposition of, you know, being in such exclusive, such an exclusive environment, literally jumping from the 1 to the 99 in the, you know, in a snap of a finger, just kind of encapsulated for me kind of like the experience of extremes in the West today. But I am interested in seeing what Johnny Depp does with the Lone Ranger. He's playing Tonto. So,
Really?
yeah, which angered some Native American groups, but you know.
Who's the Lone Ranger?
You know, I don't know. If anybody has their app, IMDb app, you can look it up.
Okay.
Well, I
Bill.
want to, first of all, I'm only like maybe 40% of the way through here, but I've already got a couple of things I wanted to ask you about. First of all, more of a commentary. On page 4, when I thought you had really a beautiful observation. It says, landscape is about who is gazing upon the land. The position of the observer creates a frame and necessarily edits the view. It says more about who is doing the gazing than what is being gazed upon. And then over here on page 97, when you're attempting to make your fabled documentary that has to do with what's going to come after an Al's bar, which you can perhaps expand on in Joshua Tree, there's this one point where you're trying, and I emphasize trying, to direct Tammy in her musings as she's walking through. And it really, I kind of want an amplification on this, because you're talking about the process of creating for writers and the difficulties, and here you are trying to get Tammy to do certain things as she's wandering through the bar, and she's doing something else. And you muse at the time, it is the devil's bargain we enter when we frame a subject in a book, film, painting, play, song. The frame will always exclude, distort, however we might yearn for the real. Was there a way to allow the subject to represent itself? Have you come to any tentative answers to your own question?
I'm not the first writer to ask themselves those questions, but thank you for raising them. I mean, they're the questions that I do my literature classes. These are the questions, you know, the ethics of representation, the devil's bargain of representing people. It comes up in all kinds of ways. Just recently, I was asked by somebody whether I give my family, whether I show my family what I write and allow them to object and compose with me. And the answer is, of course, no. I do not show. I do not ask them for approval. I don't give them veto power, but I do care very much what they think, and I use that example because ultimately, okay, if I write something mentioning my mother, write something mentioning my father, I want it first and foremost to be out of love and respect, right? I mean, this is my family, this is my blood, right? And because I know that their feelings could be hurt, because or conversely, that I might do them proud, right? Well, these are my intimates. This is blood. There is an argument to be made that if a true ethics of representation, there would be no line between intimate family and anybody else. Or if there is a line, where would you draw it? Family, neighbor, city, where does the real other begin? In other words, and so I think there's no perfect system of representation, and bottom line, because it's impossible to represent the subject fully. You're always leaving something out, as I was saying there. And that does haunt me as a writer. Did I leave out the one detail? Could I have said one more? Could I have written one more sentence that would have made a particular subject come to life more for the reader, right? So within this imperfect system of representation, filled with all these, pitfalls, how do we get the best out of it? What I was taught is that you talk about the problem, that you raise the problem itself, and make people aware that they're reading a book that's an imperfect representation, and to critique representation itself even as you're trying to represent, which is kind of like a classic postmodern kind of like critical thing, right? And I was at Mills College just a couple days ago, and I had a bunch of grad students asking me questions just like this. And the conversation just really, started popping. And we didn't resolve anything. But we were aware of the problem. And I think awareness of the problem, I think the problem is when you're not aware of the problem. So I should probably leave it at that. But thanks for raising it.
One over here?
Steve.
I'm still struggling with your suggestion that Jan Brewer is representative of the Old West. And here's why, because I'm very afraid she represents a very new West. And we've got SB 1070 and everything from, search, stop and search, to, no free speech rights, to Chicano studies is illegal because it's subversive by definition. We've got laws that are passing, supported at that level. What about your desert travels is telling you that arc is moving away from a Jan Brewer world and not towards one where the backlash may be sustained, that it is becoming a Jan
LA tells us that story. Thank you so much for asking the question. LA tells us that story. Los Angeles and California gave the world Prop 187 a generation ago. And where are we now? The demographics, even of Arizona, I've heard some political scientists say 8 years, 10, 12, at the outside, the state will flip. Actually, I read a New York Times story not that long ago about the Obama administration saying that Arizona was actually in play. Because it was only a 5-point spread. It ain't Kansas, It's not Idaho. Arizona is a relatively diverse state, which my parents can attest to, having lived in Arizona for many years. It's a nativist reaction for short-term political gain, and I would argue for long-term political pain, just like the California Republican Party. So that's where I'm using the old Western motif. They're tapping into the age-old nativist trick, which it works, but it's old, and it's not sustainable politics, right? Because it only works in a situation where demographic change is taking place. And that means that if the trend if the change continues, that part of the population that responds to the nativist reaction is actually diminishing. And so long-term, Raul Grijalva he's a progressive congressman from southern Arizona, represents Tucson and South.
Chair of the Progressive Caucus.
Chair, thank you, Bill. Absolutely, yes, exactly. Chair of the Progressive Caucus, and he's the New West. And so call me, romantically optimistic, but I think rather than Jan Brewer being the future, I really think she's just, a little bit of the ugly past rearing its head momentarily. But long term, the West is showing the country about its diversity, about its, and ultimately, like I said earlier, the West gave ultimately it handed the election to Obama. So I think it is. That's the new Western future is definitely blue and not red.
Oh, I was just wondering, when you mentioned northern New Mexico, and you did mention John Nichols, I was wondering what writers you kind of referenced or sort of informed your I don't know, what do you want to call it, study of present-day American West, either literary or nonfiction.
Sure. John Nichols, for sure. It's a great book, The Malaga Bienful War. I think it really stands up. We lived on that landscape, Angela and I, for several years, and it really the book looks like the place and vice versa. Several local writers who aren't as well known as John Nichols. There's a whole cohort of Hispano writers. They call themselves Hispanos in northern New Mexico. Esteban Arellano, Levi Romero, and in the larger Western, genre, Cormac McCarthy. I had this, he of course does not know this because I've never been anywhere near him, but I just had this long-running argument with Cormac McCarthy, And when I set out to write the book, I think I had as many models that I was writing against as I was trying to emulate, maybe more. Who I was writing against. I wanted to write against the Old West. And I really felt that McCarthy, even though some people championed him as kind of a new Western figure, I felt that there was still a lot of Old Western stuff about him, Plus, I just thought his prose was overwrought and, I was just jealous. He sells a lot more books than I do. Let's just be honest. So I was going to write against Cormac McCarthy, but then as I was rereading the Border Trilogy, and I noticed this the first time I'd read all the Pretty Horses, something that I think his politics, I can't tell what his politics ultimately are, I think you could argue either way, that he's either reactionary or I don't think he's progressive. But on the page, stylistically, there's something that he does which ideologically I think is progressive. His Spanish is not italicized. His Spanish is Roman, just like English. It's not. In other words, it's not set off. It's not made to look, a different way on the page, and which is a wonderful stylistic metaphor for integration in the borderlands and how Spanish and English really come together in the borderlands. And that's the way it's lived here. That's the way we live in this area. And there was, I know there was writers who did it before him, but he was the first one to have a big New York publisher, and having the world paying attention to start integrating language in the borderlands like that. So ultimately, I came to give grudging respect to the old curmudgeon. So many, and Western films. I mentioned P.T. Anderson just a minute ago. He's on my brain because of the buzz right now about The Master, how astonishing a film it's supposed to be. But I probably had more film things on my mind in terms of models, and P.T. Anderson's There Will Be Blood. As I was writing this, I really started the heavy writing right around the time There Will Be Blood came out, and I just still think that's probably the greatest Western. A lot of people don't even think of it as a Western, but I do. and because of the way landscape is used in it, because the boom and bust implied in the narrative of it. And I just think what P.T. Anderson did with that film is one of the greatest Western pieces of art of our generation. So, yeah.
One last question.
First, I definitely feel uncomfortable with Obama and Villaraigosa being labeled as progressives.
I didn't say they were progressives.
Okay.
I said that many progressives voted for them and helped them get elected. But
Or even the city of LA. But
okay.
I just started reading The Monkey Wrench Gang,
Yeah.
which actually, because I was reading that and I saw that you were speaking, it made me want to come to this. And what about that kind of portrayal of the West? And is that even a reality? That kind of, I mean, I know that that's what sparked the Earth First movement, and just like the kind of the horror of the dams and the mining and that kind of encroachment on this idea of the West. And is that critique, is that way of looking at things something that you came in contact with?
Oh yeah, no, yeah. Ed Abbey. I mean, before probably Cormac McCarthy is probably the best known, even though he's not from the West, and he's become kind of like the Western guy, in many ways over the last generation. But before Cormac McCarthy, I mean, it was obviously Edward Abbey was the best known of the Western writers, and I read him early on and loved and hated him. I mean, he's crazy guy, right? I mean, on the one hand, it inspires, Earth First and all these wonderful radical movements that clearly opened up a space for political discourse on environmentalism. On the other hand, he wrote screeds against Mexicans, and his border politics were really weird, and so he's a very complicated figure. But what he represents in terms of environmental history and representations of the West as a place damned and just, unreclaimed mining and the ecological disaster that the West is. I mean, if you fly over the West today, fly over New Mexico and the fields of natural gas exploitation and new oil production and new uranium mining claims, uranium mining was beat back in the 70s by coalitions of Native Americans and white progressives, and there's a whole environmental history there that's largely untold, except regionally. The West has been opened up just in the last several years to large-scale exploitation once again, and fracking happening in New Mexico right now, for example. And a huge debate over solar and wind energy right here in California. On the one hand, a lot of people would think, oh, solar and wind, sustainable, clean, right? Well, there's a lot of people in the Mojave Desert who think that those massive windmills and solar arrays are not what's needed in that particular biome. So yes, to answer your question, the West is a place. And once again, just add another layer, right, onto the West. The way we live the West today tells us how we're doing economically, culturally, politically, and environmentally. And the one cause for optimism in terms of recent environmental history begins with kind of like a tragic story. The Secure Fence Act of 2006 mandated 800 miles of new fencing along the border, which in every way, is an aesthetic disaster. It's an environmental disaster. All kinds of impacts on the land and species. On that particular issue, groups that had relatively little contact with each other and had sometimes had very negative contact with each other, environmental justice organizations and social justice advocates came together. In other words, the Sierra Club and Defenders of Wildlife came together with immigrant rights coalition groups and signed letters together and pushed Washington and actually stopped the wall. There were several injunctions. So that coalition happening in the West social justice and environmental groups coming together. That has to happen. And it's happening more and more, but I think here in the West is really where it first really started occurring. And it's happened here in Los Angeles too, Friends of the Los Angeles River, and so I think there's plenty of cause for optimism in terms of real progressive forces coming together. I take your note about Obama and the city and Villaraigosa to heart. I didn't mean to imply that this is progressive paradise. You're absolutely right about that. Yes.
West Hollywood.
There you go. But progressive forces have pushed the city. So it's moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
What I'll do is I'll move all this stuff out of the way. We'll bring out a table for him to sign.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget that you can check out this and all of our other great podcasts at www.skylightbooks.com. Today's music was provided by Fragile Gang. You can check them out at MySpace, Facebook, and the iTunes Music Store. Thanks for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.